So, Ben Zimmer, good to talk to you.
Hi, John. Good to talk to you again.
I think we're supposed to say who we are. And so, who are you, Ben?
I'm Ben Zimmer. I am on-language columnist for the New York Times Magazine and executive producer of the visual Thesaurus.
I am John McWhorter, and you may remember me from pieces written in places such as the New Republic, TheRoot.com, and some others, and I also lecture in various subjects at Columbia University. So, how did you like the president's speech last night?
Rhetorically, I think he did a fairly good job. It is difficult in the State of the Union format to have truly lofty and stirring rhetoric. It certainly wasn't stirring in the way that his speech in Tucson at the memorial for the victims of the killing there was. I mean, that obviously very different type of speech, and so there were definitely rhetorical flourishes that attempted to make it transcendent. Let's say. I was thinking throughout the speech actually of how he was using metaphors of moving up and forward. There was a lot of upward movement and forward movement, and portraying problems of the past as being sort of down and below and behind.
You know what the irony was, and I want to get to that, is that forward was a huge theme of that speech, even more so than a sort of cartoon cliched version of it would have been. Right. And there was a tug between that and the fact that the format of the State of the Union speeches is so formulaic that it's really an anthropological ritual that people are going to keep not just clapping but standing up,
right.
And that has to happen with an almost preset rhythm. And State of the Union speeches, presidential speeches, have only been like that since roughly the 30s, and even then, if we could go back to listening to Franklin D. Roosevelt, a person now who is used to participating in that ritual would be surprised at how little they were expected to stand up and how much more seldom they were expected to clap. To listen to Martin Van Buren give a speech would have been a much different thing. It's as ritualized as stand-up comedy, where there's this notion that we're so used to, but it's really rather bizarre, that someone stands up and makes a witticism and you're supposed to laugh. And their job is to make the witticisms and to have several prepared. So it really is a very phony thing in its way. The fact that it conveys any kind of information or has any kind of art ends up being kind of a garnish because there's this stage blocking that they have to go through.
Yeah, the ritualized or ceremonial aspects of it are always very, very prominent in the State of the Union, and even just the slightest tinkering with the ritualistic aspect causes great commentary. Yeah. Yes. Of course, we had the fact that the Republicans and Democrats are not sitting in their usual places, but we're doing this date night or prom night. That was a major story leading up to it, and even something as rather prosaic as the fact that he held off on saying the State of the Union is strong to the end of the speech instead of putting it at the beginning of the speech. Just a minor adjustment like that, again, was something that they chattered over, afterwards, and so yeah. I mean, the ritual aspects of it were. It's always interesting to see that, but at the same time, it's very constraining and does not lend itself well to the best of presidential rhetoric. It's difficult often to even think back on past State of the Unions and remember what they were all about. We might remember a phrase or two here or there, George W. Bush's axis of evil, Bill Clinton, the era of big government is over. Those tiny snippets might stay with us. But beyond that...
And I think that in this one, that snippet might be we do big things. That's the one that the media seems to have picked up on, and so there's one. But yeah,
we do big things. It's you can't get sort of simpler than
it was rather Bushian, wasn't it? Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I found that interesting. I mean, there's always, I guess, the attempt to actually make the message punchy in a certain way, soundbite friendly. We do big things sounds like it could be the slogan for car company. I don't know. Exactly.
That's right. Yeah, you can hear them. But you know what actually stood out in this one for me, and I frankly I found the whole thing rather dull. I get impatient with the formula. But
Yeah.
something that Obama deserves credit for is that whereas in Tucson, I think that what he summoned was his inner preacher. I think that in this speech, he summoned his inner teacher, which is something I actually wish he had done more of in Tucson. If you're going to talk about how the nation's going to come together, then if that's not going to sound like a car commercial, then you probably need to explain. And notice that last night, he did an awful lot of careful explaining and exposition. You know, he's got his hand up, and there's this tone of voice that he uses. There's this breathiness that he uses when he'll say something along the lines of, I know we will, when he does that, instead of I know we will. He wants to impart information and to make us think about things. That's not something that you got from, say, our last president in really any speech, and it's not something even that Clinton did as much, generally, as Obama did last night. I liked seeing it.
Yeah, no, I noticed that, again, especially towards the end. I mean, the fact that the State of the Union speech has to be this overstuffed, often rambling exposition, you kind of might drift off in the middle of it. I do think he started strong and he ended strong, and the strength in the beginning that I found was the callback to the Tucson speech and to the strongest parts of the Tucson speech, namely talking about the little girl who died, and talking about how the events remind us that there are, again, higher things, again, shooting for that transcendent level. So thinking about that in terms of something that is beyond partisan politics, which he's always trying to find that rhetorical footing that puts him above the fray. But then, using that figure of the little girl in Tucson as a point of reference and a point of identification as well, saying that her dreams were no different from our children's dreams. We're all part of the American family, so bringing together that.
And you know what really helped there? It's interesting. The fireside chats that Franklin D. Roosevelt did were wonderful for the audio medium, and so we're now used to that. Obama is good in audio too, but there's a visual element, and I suspect he was aware of this. He brings up the little girl, he brings up Tucson, he brings up that we all have to come together, and the visual image this time is that you've got Boehner behind him, and Boehner, despite the shall we say the hue of his skin, whether or not it's deliberately cultivated or not, is not especially telegenic. He's not used to holding his face for a long period when a camera is upon him.
Yes.
And because of the way the Republicans have been behaving and the fact that he is very much behind that McConnell-esque let's get Obama out of office ethos, he didn't look good. He looked small. He doesn't happen to be a large man, and so that didn't help him. And his facial expression tended to be rather impatient or perfunctory, or pained. Or my brother-in-law seemed to genuinely believe that he was actually starting to well up a couple of times again, and I don't think he was. But
there was the one time where Obama rather savvily, mentioned
the bar,
his story as one of these great rags to riches stories. Yeah, exactly.
Sweeping, right?
Yeah, and perhaps he welled up a bit there.
Did he? Yeah, I couldn't tell.
Just maybe a little bit in the eyes, but it is interesting too, though. I mean, this happened with the Tucson speech as well. That very same day, you had Sarah Palin's video address, and the contrast between those two was stark and much commented on it, and how that only helped Obama look more presidential in contrast to Palin, and so he sometimes has some help in that area by contrast. And of course, this time we had Paul Ryan and Michelle Bachmann giving dueling rebuttals, which ended up having the effect, I think, if anything, of pointing to divisions within the Republican Party when Democrats are supposed to be the ones that are always sort of split. Perhaps this time around, they appear to be more unified.
Yeah, the Republicans didn't look good last night. They looked a little bit snittish. And that was, and it's something that I think Obama actually is partly responsible for. A little bit of the old magic came back. What do you think, though, and this is something you brought up, and I noticed it too, a lot of this future stuff, it's quite clear I saw a few themes, linguistically, if we will, in the speech. And the one that I can tell was conscious. They sat around with their coffee and decided to do this, was pointing towards the future. And so you get, lots of we will, lots of 21st century, endure, destiny, forward, future, beyond. It worried me a little bit because it seemed like it was trying to take a helicopter and float away from the very nasty practical realities that we're dealing with right now. How do you talk about the beyond when you have a Mitch McConnell flatly saying we want to get this man out of office and therefore stand in the way of anything that the Democrats try to do? Now, maybe I'm too cynical, maybe it's because I'm nursing a cold or something, but I found the future stuff a little shallow, although it's always good for an audience. Did you like it? If I can ask the question in that simplistic way.
Well, at times it worked, I think, again, the idea I think was for his message to be transcendent. That the only way that we can move forward and find the path to the future is to rise above what's been holding us down in the past. Obviously that's very general, and he didn't really get too much into policy specifics. Obviously, in a speech that was more programmatic, let's say, and so that it ended up relying more on catchphrases like "win the future," over and over again. I think the word "future" was in the speech 15 times, mostly in that frame of winning the future, which I should probably point out was also the title of a book by Newt Gingrich, published in 2005.
I didn't catch that. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, if you go to winthefuture.com, that was snapped up years ago, I think, by a Republican in Oregon, and it now redirects you to the Oregon Republican Party website, telling how the Republicans can be the ones to win the future and not Obama.
Right.
Although, Newt Gingrich didn't invent the phrase, obviously, that's a certain trope that has been around for a while. I was just doing a little looking into that, and one interesting predecessor I found was Archibald MacLeish, who was the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. He was the Librarian of Congress under FDR, and during World War II, he said, "We who win this war will win the future." So there could be lots of possible resonance in American history with that phrase, and clearly he was going for various allusions to American history that would show us that we have the potential to move forward, that we plot the future by drawing on the strength of our past. So the whole Sputnik moment, or the Apollo projects of today, using some of the rhetoric from the Cold War era, and specifically from the Kennedys, quoted Robert Kennedy explicitly.
That was that was an important moment.
Right, about how the future is an achievement, from Robert Kennedy in 1962, I think.
When you say achievement, it actually reminds me of something else in this speech that I thought was absolutely crucial, very artful, and I don't know whether it was deliberate, but it reminded me of an idea that I think we're both aware of that was very much on the vine among Democrats in 2004 and 5 in particular, where my erstwhile colleague, the linguist at Berkeley, George Lakoff, was urging the Democrats to reframe the debate with the usage of new terminology that would avoid the negative implications of terminology that Republicans use. And Republicans seem to do this rather well in calling the estate tax the death tax, and Lakoff's idea was that Democrats turn the tables. And I think that idea was often derided as too simplistic, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure where Lakoff stands with the Democratic Party today. It seems that perhaps that particular moment of his has passed. But I've always wondered exactly why, because there is something in the idea. And I saw a lot of it last night in usages of words that Obama came up with. And he didn't flag these things, but the one that got a certain amount of attention, including from you before the speech, was to say investment instead of spending. And that's good because there's a certain frame there that you can apply to other words. And I saw it. So if you say spending, it sounds kind of exhaustive. It implies that the
Yes.
money was just thrown down some hole. If you invest it, it means that it created something. And in the same way, I noticed that the word innovation was used by Obama quite often as opposed to, say, invention. Because invention is the word that you would have expected someone to use, say, 100 years ago, 50 years ago. We need to invent things, Edison. But if you invent it, then it's over. And there's this thing that then starts rusting and becomes obsolete. If you innovate, it sounds like something that keeps going and going and going. And so therefore, innovation, innovation. If you think about it, imagine Franklin D. Roosevelt making a speech. He'd be less likely to use the word innovation several times than Obama did. Nothing.
Yeah, I did a count on that one too. Innovation, as well as related forms, innovative. Let's see, 11 times. Reinvent 4 times. Revitalize a couple of times as well. So yeah, clearly, there is a certain kind of messaging that they're going for. Certainly. It's been much discussed about investment versus spending. If you just looked at raw frequencies of those two, you would see that actually forms of the word spend showed up 14 times, forms of the word invest showed up 13 times. But of course, just looking at word frequencies doesn't really tell you very much. You have to look at exactly how they're used. And when you look at it, sure enough, spending is always in the context of cutting excessive spending. Cutting or freezing, of course, is the plan to.
Which is quite different from saying we shall spend money on.
Right. There was all of the future discussion of government allocations was in the frame of investing.
Investment. That's right.
And it's a useful metaphor in that it does a couple of different things at once, along with all the talk of competitiveness and how we have to out-innovate and so forth. It ends up having that kind of CEO sound to it, America,
precisely,
the corporation, and how we'll move it forward. And so
it has music, yeah.
And so and certainly, we've heard about his attempts to be friendly to the business community, and certainly using these sort of business-oriented figures of speech would help him in that regard. At the same time, investment has a figurative purpose as well, where the types of dividends that we can imagine an investment paying off with do not have to be strictly monetary. And so he was talking about all the different ways that current investment will pay off in the future as we put money into education and various clean technologies and infrastructure and so forth. And so, that was definitely useful for him to use. And it was actually George Lakoff back in, circa 2004, who was saying Democrats have to stop talking about spending and start talking about investment. So perhaps there is a lingering effect from George Lakoff, even though he certainly is not as buzzworthy within the Democratic Party as he was back then. The Democratic message making has continued to falter in comparison to Republicans with message gurus like Frank Luntz, who Lakoff was explicitly trying to counteract. This was quite obvious in the healthcare reform debate, where in lockstep Republicans would be trotting out talking points about how this was a government takeover or Washington takeover of healthcare and that sort of thing. So clearly there's an attempt to counteract that, learn from the mistakes of the past, and Obama seemed to be cognizant of all that. At the same time, by using the sort of business talk about investment and competitiveness and so forth, it ended up, for me at least, feeling a little bloodless, a little bit like, corporatese and that sort of thing.
And I suspect that this is part of why, because actually the theme in this continues with something else. In Obama's speech last night, you don't fix anything. You renew it, you restore it, you reform it. And once again, if you fix it, then you imagine something that is therefore fixed, it's resultative. Whereas if you restore it and you reform it and you renew it, again, there's this continuative aspect to it. You and I know, and for the linguists who are listening to this, that we're talking partly about notions of what linguists call specifically aspect.
Right.
And so there's this continuative idea. With fix, it just sits there, very punctual. With restore or renew, the story goes on and on.
And it continues from the past into the future. I mean, that
exactly
works as well, so that because it's not so,
I think that,
past-oriented or future-oriented, you can imagine a continuous progression.
Right, and what worries me about that is that another subdivision that you can think of in terms of these words like innovate and invest and renew is that you're dealing with a fundamental difference, and this was an old-fashioned way of thinking about how to put speeches together, but I think there was a value to it, between Latinate words and Anglo-Saxon words. And sometimes there's a fuzzy boundary. Some words can sound it when actually, if you look at the actual etymology, they aren't one thing or the other. But we have in our English vocabulary a difference between quote-unquote the big words and the genuine little Anglo-Saxon words. And they often have a certain kind of connotation. The Anglo-Saxon can be seen as more concrete. And I have a kind of a Robert Moses fetish as somebody who has adopted New York over the past 9 years. And I'm quite aware of what a monster he was in many ways. I've read The Power Broker all the way through twice at this point. But one thing that I do like about him is the way that he did, and sometimes with such pain to other people, but just as often not, he got things done. And he did have a linguistic philosophy. This was very much on the side of his essence, but he had a fetish for Anglo-Saxon words over Latinate words. And so, for example, if you've ever tried to get to LaGuardia on a bad day, then you get stuck on the Belt Parkway. Mm-hmm. And there were people who wanted to call it the circumlocutory whatever, and he wanted to call it the Belt Parkway because he felt that the Anglo-Saxon word sounded more concrete. And I can think of an alternate universe where Obama would talk about fixing stuff and explain how, he wouldn't say stuff, but you can fix things rather than this business of renewal, because like you say, it sounds corporate and airy. It sounds airy.
Okay, well that's true. But then he closes with the call to action that involves a very simple monosyllabic Anglo-Saxon turn of phrase. We do big things,
right?
And so it seems like he at least at the end there is trying to draw on that punchiness that comes with that.
Right, he used it as
language.
A seasoning. Whereas the truth is, a Bush is somebody who we would get impatient with because perhaps he used too much of the concrete and the deliberately punchy throughout. And so I imagine there's a balance.
Yeah, and again, sort of thinking about the messaging that's gone on over the past couple of years between Republicans and Democrats, again, going back to the healthcare debate, the kind of sterile sound of something like public option and trying to get people on board with the public option. Meanwhile, you have flamethrowers like Sarah Palin talking about death panels and so forth, using extremely visceral, often misleading language, but
it gets under the skin. Right?
Yeah, exactly. It sticks with you and can end up, really actually ultimately swaying public opinion, which is what both Luntz on the Republican side and Lakoff on the Democratic side we're well aware of, that it wasn't, even though it is simplistic to think of people as just in this kind of Pavlovian behavioristic model where they hear this word and they think that, and in the pregame this past weekend when we heard the Republicans on the Sunday morning talk shows basically trying to prime the public by saying, when you hear investment, think spending. I mean, it was like we're trying to do this mind control or something like that. So it seems like they are working with models of behavior and response to rhetoric that seem extremely simplistic.
It's simplistic, but it clearly has a certain rhetorical effect. And wouldn't it be interesting if both parties actually engaged in a concentrated attempt to filter as much of their language as possible in this way, with Luntz on one side and Lakoff on the other? And it would be interesting to see where the chips fell if both of them were concentratedly doing that all the time, if there was this kind of linguistic war. And I doubt if that will happen. But I would enjoy watching it.
Beyond just finding the felicitous words and phrases, both the euphemistic phrases for one's own positions and the dysphemistic phrases for your opponent's positions, it also requires a media infrastructure, let's say, to keep that going, and also a kind of message discipline as well. That again, that if the Republicans are all have the drum beat going for a certain message like government takeover or whatever, that ends up reinforcing it in this very strong way. Obama has the bully pulpit and the prominence, and especially the goodwill going into the State of the Union address. His poll numbers were getting better. People responded well, obviously, to the Tucson speech, and even extending back to the lame duck session, where despite the shellacking that Obama and the Democrats experienced in November, that he had a certain kind of momentum going into the speech. That could counteract the message discipline that Republicans tend to display, although, as we mentioned before, they seem to be rather fractured now with Michelle Bachmann voicing the Tea Party sentiments and that sort of thing. And,
I would venture, though, that if people replay this speech in the future, something that will have to always be given as context is Tucson.
Absolutely, yeah.
I would return to what I said near the beginning of this, which is that I actually found the speech fundamentally to not be one of the more interesting ones, and I don't think it's just because the novelty has worn off of the Obama oratory. It was very canned, and canned in a way that did not disguise it much, and I think that part of the reason that we respond to it, part of the reason that we have a sense perhaps that Obama turned a corner last night is because of all the goodwill that he had in the wake of many people's interpretation of the Tucson tragedy and the nature of the rhetoric. And I don't know how you feel. I personally don't feel that what Jared Loughner did had a whole lot to do with the way Sarah Palin and Glenn Beck talk. I honestly believe that if we had not had the kind of debates we've had over the past 2 years over what sort of rhetoric and what sort of symbolic rhetoric is used in the media, that same guy may very well have gotten a gun and done the exact same thing. But nevertheless, that's not the way most people seem to be thinking of it, and that very much filters the way we look at Obama. And it will be interesting if that one hideous chance event actually did affect the political future of our country over the next 2 years, because it seems that it may have in terms of how we look at a Democrat versus a Republican and what they stand for. Boehner, behind him, in a way, was the face for many people of what killed people in Tucson, and that had a lot to do with how we heard the president.
That may be true for some people, but the way that Obama used it was crucially, again, as a way of actually using it to build reconciliation between partisan differences. And as I said before, I think perhaps the strongest part was the beginning, and that probably helps if people were clicking away or leaving because they got bored in the middle. But the lines in the beginning that I mentioned how he said we're part of something greater. And the way that they use Gabby Gifford's empty chair, that is another sort of visual.
Also calling her Gabby, right.
Exactly. And the absent presence of her there as a reminder to put aside partisan differences was a very handy rhetorical opportunity there, but it wasn't used in an opportunistic or bluntly opportunistic fashion, and the references to Tucson were not overly morbid.
No.
And the idea that because of Tucson, therefore, we have Republicans and Democrats sitting together instead of apart. It's this bizarre kind of political calculus that because this guy, shot these people in Tucson, now at the State of the Union, people are sitting together in a new configuration. It takes a lot of unpacking to sort of see how you get from point A to point B. But again, even that was interestingly used by Obama at the beginning the speech, where he says, what comes of this moment will be determined not by whether we can sit together tonight, but whether we can work together tomorrow. So very skillful pivoting from the deictic grounding, as linguists would say, the here and now of how we are sitting together tonight, and pivoting to how we can work together tomorrow. I thought that was possibly his best rhetorical move of the night, actually.
I would politely disagree. I actually found that manipulative and simplistic, because I see McConnell and Boehner as two powerful people who are committed to not working with the other side, and who are almost proud of not having a policy of their own. And so to see our new John F. Kennedy saying that we have to work together tomorrow with the resonance of what tomorrow means, and to see the small partisan men who he actually has to deal with in order to create that, I thought, does Obama really have a sense of how that's going to happen? And does he really believe that the people who would need to listen to this are going to, or is he just singing a song? And that's the disappointment that I felt about the whole affair, tempered somewhat by the fact that he did try to engage in some serious teaching after that point. I see very much what you mean. It was deft in itself, but I worried about the slip between it and the concretes of forging actual legislation. It's just, I suppose, the mood that I'm in lately. But yeah, well, that was it. Did you see anything else interesting in the speech?
There's definitely, again, I'm sort of thinking more about the historical references, so that in almost every part of the speech where he's talking about the steps to win the future, he has these callbacks to various points in American history. So, I mentioned the Sputnik moment or whatever, but the idea that invention or innovation can be tracked from Edison and the Wright brothers through to Google and Facebook, sort of seeing that as this grand American tradition of invention. And
Google and Facebook got a little bit of applause. It was interesting.
Yeah, that was interesting. There was some scattered applause for Facebook. That actually applause is something that we should probably talk about because of the reconfigured seating for prom night or date night. That seemed to tamp down certainly the hooting and hollering, and also the applause breaks seemed to be shorter, which
somewhat
thank
shorter,
goodness, since it was already over an hour. But there were certainly some applause lines that fell flat, and again, maybe that's because people were sort of being more conscious of appearing to be more civil. All this talk about civility after Tucson, so on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, perhaps there was a kind of a toning down of emotional response, but also some humor that fell flat as well. You mentioned at the beginning about how it has the formulaic nature of a stand-up routine, and so you get that kind of tonal peculiarity when he does venture into humor, and sometimes it worked fairly well. There was the business about unnecessary regulations over salmon, and a joke about smoked salmon. That got
actually noticed that when he did the smoked line, he held with the sort of Obama naughty smile, and it wasn't getting the laugh that he expected. Yeah, I was perplexed there.
Yeah, it's interesting. There were a couple other moments too. He made a joke about the pat down, for instance, with airport security, which so. Now, obviously, with a speech that's so rehearsed and so meticulously gone over by Obama and his staff, the possibility for a successful humor is pretty limited.
It's blunted, right?
Yeah, and the one thing that really struck me as an incredibly false note was the analogy with the plane. We're talking about
that clumsy. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So basically the analogy being that if we don't have these investments in education and so forth, it's the equivalent to trying to steer a plane without the engine in it, and that you'll soon recognize the impact of it. And so his use of impact, was that supposed to be funny? If so, it was,
And notice also that he seemed to almost know there was something wrong there because he had a little stumble, like he didn't deliver it properly.
Right. So that was a sour note, and you could think of ways in hindsight about how that could have been improved. Perhaps the analogy should have been the plane on the ground trying to take off. Again, working on that imagery of taking off. And how we can't take off,
but not if it's already in the air, right?
Yeah, and that just evokes a plane crash, and you certainly don't want to have that image in the speech. So that was a surprisingly clunky bit of rhetoric.
Given that he had time to think about it, that's right.
Yeah, you would think if he's been going over this so carefully for a month that would have been vetted at some point, but
apparently it wasn't. No.
Right.
Ben, I think we've hit a point that is properly bite-sized. I think we have done a dialogue that people might listen to from beginning to end.
I hope so.
Maybe we should close at this point, unless there was something else that you were absolutely pregnant to contribute.
No, I don't want to lose people's attention. I don't want people to start dozing off in the middle like they might have been with the State of the Union.
With the hour and 15 minutes last night. That's right.
So let's keep it short and sweet.
Well, this is Ben. Let's do this again soon.
Absolutely.
And we can talk about the linguistic aspects of the next large speech that Obama or someone else makes. But so that's our take on last night, and I will see you next time.
Excellent.
Take care.
Thanks.